In the heart of Texas, where the heat rolls across flat land and concrete towns bake under the summer sun, a boy named James Lemarc Byrd began his journey down a road that would end in blood, fear, and infamy. Born in the late 1960s, Byrd grew up in a world that didn't hand out many second chances. His early years were marked by volatility, broken homes, brushes with violence, and a deep hunger for control. Those who knew him in his youth described him as quiet but simmering, someone who didn't just fight back when challenged, but made sure the other person never wanted to fight again. It was that combination of intelligence, rage, and fearlessness that would one day make him the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas's most feared soldier. As a teenager, Byrd drifted toward crime like metal to a magnet. He ran with rough crowds, mostly white kids from the fringes of Fort Worth, who found a kind of belonging in trouble. There were thefts, bar fights, drug deals gone bad, each arrest adding another scar to his record and hardening his edges. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice would soon become his true home, a world where violence wasn't just survival. It was language, loyalty, and law. By the time Byrd entered state prison for the first time, he was already well known to local police. But prison was different. It was a world ruled by races and codes. Inside, every man had to pick a side, and Byrd's pale skin and aggressive demeanor made the choice almost inevitable. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, or ABT, had been growing since the early 1980s, an offshoot of the original Aryan Brotherhood in California, but uniquely Texan in its structure. It wasn't just a gang, it was an organization, with ranks, orders, and a militarized discipline that turned convicts into soldiers. Byrd quickly impressed the right people. He was fearless in a fight and showed a cold precision that separated him from the average inmate. In a world where respect was earned with blood, Byrd didn't hesitate. He attacked rivals without warning, handled debts for higher-ranking members, and proved his loyalty in the ways that disturbed even hardened convicts. His reputation grew as someone who wouldn't just kill on command, but someone who enjoyed the power that came with it. Over time, the man everyone started calling Birdman became a name whispered across cell blocks. To some, he was a protector, a white soldier who made sure his brothers were safe. To others, he was a monster. There were stories about what he'd done to enemies, stories too graphic to confirm, but too consistent to ignore. Some inmates said he carried out his orders with ritualistic precision. Others claimed he had a sadistic streak that made even veteran members wary. In the early 2000s, as the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas expanded beyond prison walls, Byrd's skills made him invaluable. The gang had evolved from a prison-only structure into a hybrid organization, still ruled from inside, but heavily active on the streets. Meth distribution, extortion, and contract killings became part of its portfolio, with imprisoned leaders directing operations through coded letters, contraband cell phones, and loyal outside soldiers. Byrd's discipline, his ability to command fear and respect, made him the perfect candidate to take on greater responsibility. As he moved through the ranks, Byrd proved he wasn't just muscle. He was strategy. He understood hierarchy, order, and the value of fear as a management tool. In the mid-2000s, the ABT was at war with rival white gangs and sometimes even within itself, torn between regional factions and power-hungry captains. Byrd navigated that chaos with brutal efficiency, aligning himself with the strongest lieutenants and outlasting those who fell to infighting or federal indictments. But behind his rise was something darker, a fascination with domination that blurred the line between loyalty and obsession. He saw the Brotherhood not just as a gang, but as a calling. Like many white supremacist leaders, he fed on the illusion of purpose. Behind the tattoos and the violence, there was ideology. But for Byrd, power seemed to mean more than belief. He wore the skinhead identity like armor, but saw the ABT as a personal empire, a system where he could rule, command, and be feared. Outside of prison, he built a network of enforcers who operated across the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They extorted dealers, collected debts, and carried out assaults on anyone labeled a snitch or race traitor. Byrd didn't just give orders, he showed up. Witnesses later told investigators about beatings that left victims unrecognizable, and one horrifying story that became legend in law enforcement files, that Byrd once ate a piece of bread soaked in a victim's blood after a particularly savage attack, as a way to show his soldiers what true brotherhood meant. Whether that story was truth or myth didn't matter, everyone believed it, and that was enough. By the early 2000s, Byrd had reached the position of outside major, the highest rank a member could hold outside prison walls. That title came with immense power. He was responsible for reorganizing the gang's street operations across Texas, coordinating between imprisoned generals and free world lieutenants. His word carried the weight of life and death, and his authority was almost absolute. Law enforcement took notice. Byrd's movements were tracked, his associates followed, his calls intercepted. Federal and state agencies had already been working for years to dismantle the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas through targeted prosecutions under organized crime statutes. But Byrd's leadership made the gang more resilient. Even as other leaders were locked down in isolation units, Byrd managed to keep operations running. He acted as the bridge, the vital link between those behind bars and those roaming the streets. To prosecutors, he was the embodiment of everything the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas represented: violent, secretive, and impossible to intimidate. To his men, he was a symbol of power, someone who had survived decades of war, lockdowns, and raids, and was still standing. But as with every kingpin, the higher Byrd climbed, the more enemies he made, both within his own ranks and within law enforcement. His arrogance, his temper, and his absolute control would eventually set the stage for his fall. In a world where brotherhood was built on fear, James Lemarc Byrd didn't just follow the code, he rewrote it. But in Texas, power never stays unchallenged for long. By the time James Lemarc Birdman Byrd became the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas's outside major, his name carried an almost mythical weight in the criminal underworld. To his followers, he was more than a leader. He was the embodiment of strength, loyalty, and absolute control. His presence could silence a room, and his word could send a man to his grave. On the streets of Texas, the ABT's iron grip began tightening once again, and Byrd was the hand that turned the screw. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas wasn't a gang of unorganized skinheads looking for fights. It was an empire that operated with military precision, structured, ruthless, and obsessed with discipline. Byrd's role as outside major placed him at the center of that empire. His orders flowed down to regional lieutenants, who in turn commanded local crews. Each member knew their place, and Byrd made sure they never forgot it. Under his command, the gang's operations became more coordinated and profitable, expanding across methamphetamine networks, weapons trafficking, and brutal enforcement work. He was sent to the Dallas-Fort Worth area to bring order to chaos. Years of internal fighting and fragmented leadership had weakened the gang's street presence. Byrd arrived like a general restoring discipline to an army. His methods were swift and bloody. Those who questioned him vanished or ended up in hospital beds. Former members later testified that Byrd's word was absolute. A violation of his command wasn't just punished, it was erased. One former ABT affiliate recalled a meeting held in a dimly lit garage in Arlington. Byrd stood before a circle of men, his voice calm, his tone surgical. He talked about loyalty, obedience, and purity, not of race, but of brotherhood. He reminded them that they were soldiers, not criminals, that their existence depended on unity and fear. Then, as if to prove a point, he ordered one of the members accused of theft to be checked. What followed was a beating so savage that the man was left unconscious. Byrd didn't flinch. He simply wiped his hands, lit a cigarette, and told the group to clean the mess. That was Byrd's way of teaching discipline, not through words, but through demonstration. His rise also came during a time of increasing attention from law enforcement. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas had become one of the most powerful and violent prison gangs in the state, with influence stretching into multiple counties. Murders, kidnappings, and drug deals were traced back to its members. And in the middle of it all, the name Birdman kept surfacing, in intercepted calls, in letters, and in whispered prison gossip. To the outside world, Byrd seemed unstoppable. He had money, loyal soldiers, and a reputation built on terror. But behind the scenes, the foundation was beginning to crack. The state's organized crime task forces, including the Texas Department of Public Safety, the FBI, and local law enforcement, had begun quietly assembling a case. They weren't just chasing the street-level players anymore. They wanted the architects. And James Byrd was one of the top names on that list. Investigators began tracking his movements, tapping phones and flipping lower-ranking members who had grown tired of living in fear. Piece by piece, they built a picture of Byrd's empire, a network of drug runners, enforcers, and lieutenants who operated under strict orders to kill anyone suspected of betrayal. Many of these soldiers were already in and out of the system, leaving a paper trail that helped prosecutors connect Byrd to crimes committed hundreds of miles apart. One such case involved the kidnapping and brutal assault of a man believed to have stolen meth and cash from an ABT stash house. Witnesses told police that Byrd himself oversaw the punishment. The victim was beaten, bound, and tortured before being dumped on the side of a rural road. He survived, barely, but was too terrified to testify. It wasn't until years later, when investigators promised protection, that the victim described the attack and how Byrd had leaned down, looked him in the eyes, and told him, "This is what happens when you steal from the Brotherhood." Another story that haunted detectives came from inside the gang itself. Members whispered about Byrd's sadism, about the night he allegedly ate bread soaked in a victim's blood after a violent beating. The story was so grotesque that it seemed impossible. But when multiple witnesses repeated it during later investigations, it became part of his legend and his prosecution. To the courts, it wasn't just about proving a crime. It was about showing how far Byrd would go to command loyalty through fear. By 2013, the walls were closing in. A multi-agency operation had quietly gathered enough evidence to go after Byrd under the Texas Kingpin statute, a law designed for organized crime leaders who ordered, rather than directly committed, acts of violence. The prosecutors knew Byrd's conviction would be a turning point. If they could bring down the outside major, they could disrupt the gang's entire communication chain. But taking him down wouldn't be easy. Byrd was cautious and moved with the precision of someone who'd survived decades of gang politics. He communicated through coded letters, switched phones frequently, and kept his meetings small and isolated. Yet even the most disciplined soldiers make mistakes, And Byrd's came when he underestimated how closely law enforcement was watching. In late 2013, investigators made their move. Raids were conducted across Tarrant County and neighboring regions, targeting key members of the ABT. Dozens were arrested, and among them were Byrd's closest associates. In the chaos of arrests and interrogations, the fragile loyalty that Byrd had enforced through fear began to crumble. Faced with sentences and the possibility of never seeing daylight, several of his lieutenants agreed to talk. Their testimonies painted a picture of a man who ruled through terror, someone who ordered kidnappings, sanctioned beatings, and commanded respect through acts of pure cruelty. They described meetings, coded communications, and a chain of command that led straight to Byrd. The prosecution's case became ironclad. In 2015, after months of preparation, Byrd's trial began in Tarrant County. The courtroom was packed, law enforcement, reporters, and even former gang members wanting to see if the legend of Birdman would finally end. The prosecution built its case, combining forensic evidence, phone records, and witness testimony. They argued that Byrd wasn't just a gang leader. He was the heartbeat of a criminal network that had spread violence across Texas. The defense tried to portray him as a scapegoat, a man being punished for the sins of an entire organization. But every time they tried to humanize Byrd, prosecutors reminded the jury of the stories, the violence, and the fear. One prosecutor compared him to a character from Sons of Anarchy, not for glamour, but because of how completely he embodied the outlaw code, ruthless, loyal only to power, and addicted to control. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, assault, and directing a street gang under the state's organized crime statute. The sentence was severe but measured, 50 years in prison. For law enforcement, it was a triumph, a major blow against the ABT's upper structure. For Byrd, it was merely a change of battlefield. When the sentence was read, Byrd didn't flinch. He looked at the judge the same way he had looked at his victims, calm, detached, almost amused. He knew what awaited him in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice: isolation, surveillance, and a lifetime inside concrete walls. But he also knew that the Aryan Brotherhood never truly dies in prison. It adapts, regenerates, and continues to rule from within. As he was led away in handcuffs, the man known as Birdman turned once more toward the gallery, not in remorse, but in defiance. His legend had been written in blood, and he wasn't ready to let it end. When James Lemarc Birdman Byrd entered the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System to begin his 50-year sentence, prison officials knew exactly who they were dealing with. This wasn't an average inmate. Byrd was a general, a man who'd commanded loyalty and fear across Texas. His arrival was met not with routine intake procedures, but with containment measures reserved for the most dangerous and influential prisoners in the state. From day one, Byrd was classified as a high-risk security threat, destined for long-term segregation. Prison had always been his natural environment, the place where his name carried weight, where violence was not only currency but heritage. Yet this time was different. The 2015 conviction wasn't a temporary setback. It was meant to be the end of his reach. The state was determined to isolate Byrd, to strip him of the ability to command his soldiers from behind bars, as so many Aryan Brotherhood leaders had done before. The transfer orders sent him to one of Texas's most secure facilities, a place where light came through narrow slits of reinforced glass, and conversation traveled only through steel doors. But isolation only sharpened Byrd's legend. For many of the younger white inmates entering the system, his name was sacred. They spoke about him in whispers. The Birdman, the outside major who took on the state and never bent. Letters smuggled between prisons carried his words. Sometimes only a phrase or two, coded but powerful. Even cut off from the outside, Byrd's influence seemed to bleed through concrete. He had become a myth inside a machine built to erase him. Over time, the pressure of isolation began to build. Prison officials monitored his mail, intercepted his communications, and even rotated guards to prevent corruption. The Texas Department of Public Safety had warned that Byrd remained a threat even in solitary confinement. For years, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas had operated like a shadow government inside the prison system, issuing orders, collecting taxes, and punishing disobedience. The authorities' fear was simple, that Byrd, with his organizational discipline and reputation, could rebuild that network from within. There were reports that he tried. Through cryptic letters, he reached out to loyalists, some of whom were already serving sentences for the same crimes that had brought him down. The communications weren't direct commands, but they didn't have to be. A simple, "Stay solid" or "Hold the line" from Byrd carried the weight of an entire ideology. It was enough to keep the myth alive, enough to make the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas continue to see him as one of their last true generals. Inside, Byrd maintained the same cold, commanding demeanor that had defined his life. He spoke little, observed much, and held himself apart from the chaos that defined most high-security units. Guards described him as methodical, his bed always made, his routine precise. He wasn't loud or erratic like many others in segregation. He was calm, and that calm unnerved everyone around him. It wasn't peace, it was calculation. Those who crossed paths with him, inmates, staff, even chaplains, said Byrd carried an aura that felt both magnetic and dangerous. One correctional officer later described it as looking at someone who knows something you don't, like he's already made peace with the darkness inside him. Byrd rarely showed emotion, except when conversations turned to the Brotherhood. Then, a spark would light behind his eyes. To him, prison wasn't punishment. It was home turf, the crucible where Brotherhood was tested and where weakness had no place. But even legends fade under the weight of years. By the early 2020s, Byrd was in his mid-50s, aging inside a system that had stripped him of control. Time had become his new warden. The endless repetition, the clang of metal doors, the sound of boots on concrete, the smell of bleach and sweat, began to erode even his unbreakable composure. He had no family visits, no friends left on the outside, who weren't either dead, incarcerated, or in hiding. The very machine of loyalty he had built had consumed everyone around him. Still, he refused to show weakness when officials offered him opportunities. For behavioral interviews or debriefings, he refused. He would not speak against the Brotherhood. He would not confess, apologize, or compromise. His silence became his last weapon, a final act of defiance in a life built on control. Yet beneath that defiance, there were signs of decline. Solitary confinement does not just break the body, it fractures the mind. Reports indicate that Byrd's health began to deteriorate in the final years of his sentence. Long stretches of isolation can blur the boundaries of reality. And though Byrd remained stoic, those close to him noticed a difference. His letters became shorter, more erratic. The once structured handwriting turned uneven, as if the discipline that had defined him was slipping away. For prison officials, Byrd was still a priority inmate. They knew that any harm that came to him could ignite tensions across multiple prisons, but there was also a strange sense of inevitability surrounding his confinement. Men like Byrd rarely lived quiet lives, and they almost never died quietly. There were whispers, rumors of grudges within the Brotherhood, of younger soldiers eager to rise, of internal power shifts that might have made Byrd more liability than legend. Whether those whispers held truth, no one could prove. On January 26, 2025, inside the Alfred D. Hughes unit in Coryell County, Texas, the story of James Lemarc, Birdman Byrd, came to an abrupt and silent end. Sometime during the early hours of the morning, correctional officers making rounds found him unresponsive in his cell. He was 56 years old. Medical staff rushed to his side, but by the time they reached the prison infirmary, he was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was not immediately released, fueling speculation both inside and outside prison walls. To the outside world, his death was a footnote, another inmate gone in a system filled with thousands of them. But to those who had lived under his shadow, it was seismic. Among ABT members, reactions were mixed. Some mourned the passing of a leader who had defined their generation. Others saw it as an opportunity, the end of an old guard that had ruled through terror and discipline. Within days, graffiti began appearing on cell walls and yard fences. Fly high Birdman. Respect to the Major. His legend, even in death, refused to die. In the aftermath, investigators reviewed every aspect of his final weeks. His meals, his medical records, his interactions. The secrecy around his death only deepened the mythology. Some whispered that he had been killed, silenced before he could reveal secrets. Others believed his body had simply given out after decades of violence, confinement, and rage. In truth, it might have been a combination of both. A man whose physical shell could no longer contain the darkness that had defined him. For the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Byrd's death marked the end of a long chapter in the war against prison gangs. For years, his name had represented the worst of organized white supremacist violence inside Texas prisons. His conviction in 2015 had been hailed as a victory for law enforcement, a symbolic blow to the ABT's leadership. Yet his death also underscored a sobering truth, that even behind bars, the reach of these organizations endures, their leaders revered as martyrs long after they're gone. James Lemarc. Byrd's story didn't end with a confession or redemption. It ended the way he had lived, in silence, under steel and shadow. He had spent a lifetime building an empire of fear, and in the end, it consumed him. The same loyalty that once made men kneel now belonged to ghosts. The same power that made him untouchable had trapped him in a cell from which even his legend couldn't escape. And yet across the sprawling landscape of Texas prisons, his name still carried weight. Whispered in the corners of rec yards, scrawled in coded letters, etched into the mythology of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. In a world where power is fleeting and survival is the only creed, Birdman had achieved the one thing every outlaw desires: immortality through fear. When James Lemarc Birdman, Byrd's death was announced inside the Texas prison system, it rippled through the walls like a quiet explosion. Word traveled fast, through hushed voices in chow halls, scribbled kites slipped under doors, and coded whispers on contraband phones. Some inmates thought it was a rumor. Men like Byrd didn't just die, they vanished into legend. But when officials confirmed it, the disbelief turned into silence, the kind reserved for fallen generals. For the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, Byrd's passing was more than the loss of a leader. It was the end of an era. Byrd had been one of the last of the old guard commanders, molded in the brutal discipline of the 1980s and 1990s, when the gang was less about profit and more about principle, hierarchy, and violence as identity. To many within the organization, he represented what the Brotherhood used to be: uncompromising, militaristic, and unflinchingly loyal. His leadership style, though tyrannical, had held the gang together through internal wars and state crackdowns. Without him, a vacuum opened. And in a system like Texas, power vacuums are invitations for blood. Within days, investigators monitoring prison communications noticed an uptick in coded messages and gang chatter. The ABT was recalibrating. Leadership changes were being discussed in cryptic phrases, nicknames, and biblical references. Some members declared that Byrd's death had been part of a cleansing, a sign that the gang needed to return to its roots. Others saw it as a signal to move forward, to shift from the rigid command structure that had led to so many indictments. Either way, Byrd's absence reignited old rivalries among regional factions, particularly between units in East Texas and the Dallas-Fort Worth corridor, where Byrd had once ruled with an iron fist. Outside the walls, law enforcement officials reacted differently. To prosecutors who had spent years chasing Byrd, his death marked the quiet conclusion to a case that had consumed a decade of effort. They'd watched as his trial became a symbol of the state's fight against organized prison gangs. And now, 10 years later, they saw his end as proof that the system could outlast even its most feared figures. But there was no celebration, only reflection. As one investigator put it, men like Byrd don't die clean. Their influence lingers long after their pulse stops. The task forces that had once hunted Byrd understood that his death wouldn't dissolve the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. If anything, it might embolden them. In gang culture, death in custody often transforms leaders into martyrs. Byrd's story, from street soldier to outside major to fallen king, fit perfectly into the mythology that fuels such organizations. Already, murals and tattoos honoring his name began to appear across Texas prisons and halfway houses. Fly High Birdman became a coded tribute, scrawled in pen ink on cell walls and gang notes. It wasn't mourning, it was reverence. But for those who'd lived under his reign, the feelings were mixed. Some remembered him as a visionary, a man who gave order and purpose to lost, violent men. Others remembered only the fear. Former gang members who had since renounced their ties recalled Byrd's methods with a mixture of awe and disgust. They spoke about his calculated punishments, his obsession with control, and the way he turned loyalty into a weapon. He didn't need to raise his voice, one former ABT soldier later said. You knew what he wanted just by the way he looked at you. And if you failed him, you prayed for mercy you weren't going to get. The years following Byrd's death revealed the deeper consequences of his legacy. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas had changed under his leadership. He had reshaped it from a scattered group of violent inmates into a paramilitary-style organization with business ambitions. Drugs became the gang's bloodstream. Byrd's approach had merged ideology with profit, using white supremacist rhetoric to justify a criminal economy. That hybrid model outlasted him. Even after his death, the structure he built continued to operate, driven by men who had once served beneath him. At the same time, his death forced the state to confront the uncomfortable truth about power inside its prisons. For decades, Texas had poured millions into combating gangs through lockdowns, isolation, and intelligence programs. Yet somehow, men like Byrd still managed to command loyalty, communicate orders, and shape criminal enterprise from behind steel doors. His life, and the failure to completely silence him, was a reminder that control in a prison is never absolute. In the months that followed, official statements about his death remained minimal. The cause of death was eventually listed as natural causes pending further review. But few inside the system believed that explanation. Theories circulated endlessly: that Byrd had been poisoned, that he had suffered a heart attack triggered by stress, or that he had finally been targeted by enemies who saw his power fading. None of these stories could be confirmed, but each added a new layer to his legend. In the mythology of the Brotherhood, truth mattered less than narrative. Meanwhile, the world outside the prison walls barely noticed. To the public, Byrd was just another name in the endless news cycle of Texas inmates. The headlines that once blazed his capture and conviction were long forgotten. There were no vigils, no obituaries, no family statements. He died as he had lived, largely invisible to society, seen only by those who walked in his world of concrete violence and codes. And yet among criminologists, journalists, and gang experts, Byrd's life became a case study. His story embodied the evolution of organized prison crime in Texas, how racial ideology, violence, and business merged into something more sophisticated and enduring. They noted how Byrd, like other high-ranking figures before him, turned incarceration into a command post. His 50-year sentence had been designed to bury him, but instead, it immortalized him inside the culture he ruled. In retrospect, Byrd's legacy is one of contradiction. He was both disciplined and deranged, intelligent yet self-destructive. He believed in the Brotherhood's creed of loyalty and order, but in pursuing it, he destroyed the very men he claimed to lead. He saw himself as a soldier fighting for purpose, but his battles left nothing behind. No ideology, no redemption, only fear and memory. Those who study men like Byrd often speak of a cycle, how one leader falls only for another to rise, how violence begets structure, and structure breeds more violence. Byrd understood that cycle better than most. It was what he built his life on. He knew that no prison could contain an idea, even one as toxic as the Brotherhood's sense of belonging. That was the paradox of his existence. He ruled through fear, but the fear itself ensured his immortality. Today, nearly a year after his death, James Lemarc Byrd remains a ghost in the Texas prison system. His name is still spoken in coded reverence, still referenced in intercepted gang notes. For those who enforce the law, as a reminder of how deep the roots of organized hate can grow inside the cracks of the criminal justice system. Byrd's story is ultimately one of decay. A man consumed by control who mistook brutality for brotherhood and fear for loyalty. In the end, all that remained of James Lemarc Byrd was a number, a cell, and a whisper. His kingdom of violence had turned to dust, and the only thing left of the Birdman was the echo of his own creation, a gang that outlived its leader, built on the very chaos he once swore to command. As one retired investigator put it years later, reflecting on Byrd's life, he thought he was the architect of something immortal. But in the end, he was just another ghost in the machine.